Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the second session in our two-part webinar event on integrated forecasting, planning, and scheduling for process manufacturing. For those of you who may not have seen me last week, my name is Sabina Kadar. I'm the marketing coordinator at Business Forecast Systems. And joining me today, I have Hans Albright. He's the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for ATS Lean Scheduling International. And we also have with us Eric Subatis. He's the Director of Sales at Business Forecast Systems. So before we get started, let me go through just a bit of housekeeping. So today's session is scheduled for 60 minutes, where we're going to give a refresher of last week's webinar. In that session, we discussed an integrated approach to forecasting, planning, and scheduling. And today we'll present some demonstrations of our best of breed solutions, Forecast Pro and Opcenter Planning and Scheduling, which is formerly known as Preactor. Today's session is being recorded and it'll be posted and made available for future viewing. And for those of you who may have missed last week's session, that was also recorded. That's also available on YouTube. So we encourage all of you to interact with us here today. All questions are welcome. If you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the questions pane at any time during this presentation. We'll be holding these questions and then we'll answer them at the end of today's session. And just know that all attendees are going to remain anonymous to all other attendees throughout. So now let me turn it over to Eric Subatis to get us started.
All right, thanks, Sabina. And sorry for jumping the gun on the slide there. I'm a little trigger happy, I guess.
No problem.
All right, so yeah, just a little roadmap of what we're going to cover today. Like Sabina said, this is the second part of a two-part webinar series. We're covering sort of end-to-end planning, going from forecasting all the way to scheduling. Last week, we covered it more at a kind of high-level conceptual level, if you will, with sort of just a brief introduction to the software tools we're going to talk about today, with the aim today of more concretely demonstrating those steps using said tools. So what we're going to start with is just a very brief recap of what we talked about last week, and then we'll move pretty swiftly into the software tools themselves. So like last time, we're going to go in basically chronological order of this planning. So we'll start with the forecasting with a brief demonstration of that forecasting in Forecast Pro. The goal here will be sort of a day in the life of a rolling forecast, going from automatic statistical forecasting through a process of forecast review with sort of an underlying theme of managing the forecast by exception. And then I'll hand it over to Hans.
Yep, and I'll take it from there, and I'll start out with the planning, where I'll show you very high level, basically the stock and capacity planning capabilities of Opcenter Advanced Planning. And then we'll move into the schedule, again, showing you some of the basics of the schedule, but then I'm also going to focus on three very industry specific issues that we see in the process industries. And I'll go over that just a little bit more in a few moments.
Perfect. Okay, so let's recap what we covered last week. Hans and I will recap a bit of each, and then we'll kind of jump into it. So last week, like I said, we covered stuff at kind of a higher level. We also went in chronological order. So we started with an introduction to forecasting. We answered some basic questions. So for example, why do we forecast? Sort of the crux of that was really to kind of rationalize our planning, since the forecast forms the basis of the assumptions that drives most of the rest of the decisions that we're making, right? The forecast is the rationale for why we're scheduling or planning a certain way. We also talked about the evolution of a forecasting process. Most folks tend to start in spreadsheets with a heavy emphasis on their judgment. And then we start to kind of evolve from there to automate our forecasting and ultimately implement more customized approaches. And so in that vein, we introduced Forecast Pro very briefly, but of course, we'll cover an example of that customized approach using Forecast Pro today.
And then last week, I talked about planning and scheduling at a conceptual level. What is APS, and what can be gained from the tool set? What are the different ways that it can support all the value drivers that you have in your business? And then I introduced specifically Opcenter APS and introduced the two aspects of that, the planning and the scheduling. and then basically teed it up so that we can go over it today and see the software in motion.
Very cool. Okay, so we also talked a little bit about kind of big picture last week. So, going to kind of gloss over it a little bit here, but I did want to call up this slide again from last week because I think it does sort of frame pretty specifically what we're going to go through today. Because, we're going to be demonstrating sort of these individual components of this end-to-end planning, but, it's worth sort of really kind of underscoring that once again, these are components of one contiguous planning process. And so this is sort of a flow of the data through each software tool. And so in a nutshell, the historic demand is sort of the starting point. That flows into Forecast Pro as sort of the primary data driver of the demand forecasting. The primary output from that is the demand forecast itself, which along with the supply forecast goes into Opcenter PL. This is where a lot of the planning happens. We're going to push that plan into Opcenter SC, which is where the scheduling occurs. Hans talked last week about sort of the importance of long-term versus short-term planning. And so, the scheduling, of course, is more on the kind of tactical portion of that. That being said, this information is being passed to and from our other systems, including ERP and MES. And of course, as Hans highlighted last week, there are also individual reports flowing out of each individual component. And I'll just call that out once again, because sort of in the spirit of this, divide and conquer by splitting up our planning into individual measurable phases, those reports, allow us to sort of measure the performance of each of these individual components with the aim, obviously, of improving the process as a whole. So with all that said, let's kind of get into the meat of it. We're going to start with talking about the beginning, which is the demand forecasting and sort of a demonstration of Forecast Pro. Just in case anyone was not on the call last week, once again, my name's Eric Subatis. I'm the Director of Sales with Business Forecast Systems. We're the developers of Forecast Pro, and sort of the 10-second version here is we've been around for a long time, about 35 years, and we've helped thousands of organizations improve their forecasting using both Forecast Pro and the educational resources that we provide. So like I said, kind of quick version there because I want to get right into the meat of it. Today, we're going to walk through a demonstration of Forecast Pro. It's going to be about 15 minutes or so. And the goal here is really to kind of show you a day in the life of a rolling forecast. The key phrase there is the rolling forecast portion, right? So the assumption here is we've already been forecasting for a few cycles. And what we're jumping into here is a new cycle with a new month's worth of data. What are the steps that a forecaster might conventionally take to update and manage that forecast? And so we'll start with just a touching on the automation portion of it, right? How do we automatically generate a statistical forecast based on our data? That's the quick part. It's effectively just a button press. We'll walk through an example of a forecast review. And so sort of the three key challenges there tend to be dealing with anomalies in our data. So, events like business interruptions or promotional activity. Then we'll move into a review of new products. So the flip side of the data question is, okay, I might have anomalies in my data, but what if I have very little data or no data at all, right? We typically need to manage our new product introductions more carefully. And that's typically part of a rolling forecast review. And then finally, we get into collaboration with other stakeholders, right? So we talked last week about, it's important to introduce objectivity via the statistical forecast, but on the other hand, our own domain knowledge about our business and our industry is still very valuable. And so this is where we still typically want to incorporate it where we can to augment the forecast. And like I said earlier, sort of the underlying theme is going to be doing as much of this as possible by exception. In other words, our scale could be quite large here. And so we want to be intelligent about how we move through our data and find things like our outliers and decide where we need to be having conversations about the forecasts. Okay. All right, so that's kind of big picture. Let's jump straight into it. At this point, you should be seeing Forecast Pro. If not, just complain loudly and we'll make sure we are. Okay, so we jump into Forecast Pro here. Like I said, the assumption here is that we are starting a new cycle in our rolling forecast. What that implies is we have a new month's worth of data that we're now ready to incorporate into our forecast. In that respect, when we jump into Forecast Pro, we're greeted with this, at a glance, kind of boring box, but it's an important one. Because what it basically tells us is, hey, I noticed that you have a new period's worth of sales. Are you ready to reforecast in light of that information while still carrying over all the changes that you've made before, right? Because if this is just the next cycle in an ongoing series of cycles, we presumably have already touched the forecast in a few places, and we don't necessarily want to start from scratch. So as the forecaster, we're effectively just pressing the button, and the system is going to dynamically regenerate automatically the statistical forecasts while still carrying over changes we've already made. Now, when we jump into the tool, if anyone uses Forecast Pro already on the phone, I realize some of this will be basic, but for those of you that have never seen it before, on the graph, what we're looking at is the historical demand in the green line and our forecasts here in the red. Okay, so these are all monthly buckets, total history, total forecasts. I talked last week a bit about the importance of visualizing your forecasts. And when I did that, I not only alluded to seeing your forecasts and your data graphically, but also this hierarchy that you see here on the left, right? I talked a little bit about the importance of hierarchical forecasting. And from the visualization perspective, what I said was, well, it can really help you understand and visualize how is your demand organized, right? And that the big obvious example there is we can easily do things like break out by customer, right? So I can break things out by category, by customer, and see the individual products that I sell to individual customers. From a forecasting perspective, that hierarchy allows us to capture individual patterns within these customers, right? So customer behavior can vary. And so this allows us to capture that on the model level. And then furthermore, and we'll get more into this later when we talk about the collaborative piece, but of course, different people in your organization might have perspectives from different dimensions. So for example, your sales folks are likely to have a pulse specifically to customers. If I go to the account rep for Food King, it's a lot easier to have a eye-to-eye conversation if I can immediately jump to Food King and look at the SKUs here, right? As opposed to giving them some big aggregate for SKU 1001 and trying to have them on the fly suss out their contribution to that, right? It allows us to have those conversations more easily. Okay. All right, so I've waxed poetic about the hierarchy enough. Kind of getting back to our typical steps. The first thing that we did is we generated a statistical forecast. This was just a button press. There's not a lot to be said here. And for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go into great detail on, for example, how our algorithm works. The quick version is that there's a variety of models built into the tool to forecast your data. And a lot of them are very robust for business data. The default is to do all of that automatically. So in other words, it's very geared toward the layperson, where you don't need to know anything about the models to get a bunch of forecasts and capture patterns like seasonality and trend and so on. And anecdotally, most of our clients lean very heavily into the automatic forecasting for good reason. So step one, we generate an automatic forecast. Step two, we jump into this forecast review, which once again, we're going to talk about outliers. We're going to review our new products, and then we're going to talk to our colleagues and see if we need to make any additional tweaks before we kick out the forecasts. Like I said, sort of the theme here is, well, I could go through my data and hunt for outliers one by one, right? But that's not going to be very efficient if we're dealing with thousands of products. It's like hunting for a needle in a haystack. So in that respect, like I said, the theme is let's kind of manage this more by exception. How can we be smart about how we hunt for these sorts of issues? There's a variety of ways to flag exceptions, first of all. And I think one thing to keep in the back of your mind is you can define the exceptions that are important to you in your forecasting. An example I'll use here, though, is in light of the fact that our forecast is changing on a rolling basis, one way to find these issues is to say, well, where has the forecast suddenly changed from last month to the next by a lot? And so here's an example of an exception view where we can see for a bunch of items, what's the current forecast? what's last month's forecast, and what are the differences. And so in this case, we've sorted it by percent difference. And now on the fly, I can click through and see, what are these biggest differences from last month to the next, and do we need to review them more closely? Now, when I set up this example, I was tempted to just make a really clean one and say, oh, first one, here's an outlier, let's clean it up. But then I realized, let's be more realistic about this. Data is messy. It's not likely that you're going to look at all top 10 and make an immediate change to all of them, right? There's a judgmental aspect here. And so as we leaf through them, one thing to keep in mind is if I look at this and nothing jumps out at me, and or I can't, comfortably or concretely explain, why this forecast may have changed, that's actually a perfect example of where we should typically probably lean into the automatic forecasting. In other words, I shouldn't come in here and arbitrarily change this just because my attention was called to it. On the other hand, as I continue to leaf down this list, right, if I come across something like this, where there is a big drop, and whether I know or I talk to somebody and I find out, say that there was a supply issue here, and that's why our sales dropped from the tens of thousands to the hundreds, well, that's an example of where we might clean this up. And so a couple ways to do this. The conventional way in Forecast Pro is to build what's called an event. And so point and click, I can flag this as a supply issue, commit it, and the forecast will simply update and change and account for that issue on the fly. As another example, what I did there is compare current forecast to old forecast. You can also just rely on Forecast Pro's automatic outlier detection and correction. And so this just more conventionally looks at your data and flags things that might be outside of a certain range of standard deviations, for example. And so just concretely, if you look at the graph, Forecast Pro can flag here in the light green things that we might want to review. And so the same rule applies. If I can't necessarily explain these, I may not want to touch them. But if I find one that I can, once again, we can simply clean them up as we find them. And the thing to keep in mind is once we clean them up, next month, we're going to repeat this process again, right? But we don't need to repeatedly clean up these outliers. We flag them, they're good to go. And next cycle, we're just going to be looking for the new ones. So step one, generate a statistical forecast automatically. The typical step two is, okay, in light of that, let's review our data and see if we can find obvious or glaring problems there. Next, let's review new products, right? If we don't have a lot of data, we can't lean into that automatic forecasting. So how can I approach those more effectively? You may be able to find some of them if you don't have a lot of NPIs routinely. But in this case, I'm sorting by the number of months of data that we have. And so very quickly, I can find, hey, this item has no data whatsoever. There's a couple ways to treat new products. We could say, talk to sales and simply key in numbers. If customers are giving us insight into initial orders, we could pop those in. There are also ways of incorporating similar products to our new product forecasting. But what I'm going to demonstrate here as an example is a pretty routine new product task, which is what you might think of as product mapping, right? A lot of times the SKU number changes, and all I really want to do is map the old history to the new one, right? And just continue forecasting it as normal. And so just as a matter of routine, I've identified the new product. I see that 1001B is an extension of 1001, and I map them together, and my new product review task is done for the period I've made the mapping. Okay. And so finally, at this point, we've reviewed our outliers, we reviewed our new products. Now let's review with our colleagues, right? Presumably at this point, we will have a baseline forecast that we're presumably pretty comfortable with, right? We've kind of dealt with the issues that might be in our data. And now we want to talk to some folks as sort of a final sanity check. Bear in mind, I'm using sales as an example here. It could be anyone in your organization, or the forecaster themselves may make their own changes. But once again, the key here is we don't want to be doing these arbitrarily. So in this case, we have 4 salespeople. We can do things like slice and dice it based on salesperson. So if I'm talking to my best salesperson, Pedro Martinez, I can filter down to his items. We're also filtering it down by volume, right? So we're only looking at Pedro's biggest sellers. And in the spirit of exception reporting, we're also sorting this by forecast accuracy for last month's forecast. Or to put that another way, we're looking at the least accurate forecasts first from last month for the highest volume items that Pedro sells. Now that's all important because particularly with sales, right, we want them out there selling, right, not necessarily spending a ton of time with their forecast. And so to make the most of my and Pedro's time, now we have a much shorter list of items to review with Pedro. And as we look through these, you know, we want to kind of thumbs up, thumbs down in this forecast, and we want to gain insights from him. So if Pedro looks at this and says, well, we expect, you know, these numbers look pretty good, but we expect a promotion with Groceryland in spring of next year, you know, why don't you bump that up by 20%? I can make that change on the fly and document why we're making that change. Okay, so pretty straightforward. It's worth noting that some organizations are going to do a lot more of this than others, right? In some cases, you know, you may be able to rely on your historical data a lot. In others, like let's say you're a very project-driven business or more make to order, you know, you may end up relying on your sales folks or customer insight a lot more, right? Because it might be driven less by seasonality than by specific customer behavior. But in either case, the key is we can make those changes and document them. Okay. Now, at this point, we've sort of gone through the typical steps. We've generated an automatic forecast. We've gone through our outliers, our new products, and reviewed with our colleagues. And now we want to kick out the results. As just a very quick detour here, I want to ensure Hans has plenty of time to go through the following steps. But as a very quick detour, you know, we touched on sort of the reports that might be coming directly out of Forecast Pro. There's a variety of those. And once again, these mostly go back to looking at metrics to improve your process over time. And with the exception views, we've sort of already been doing that, but more on a tactical basis, right? How do I use those exception views and reports to drive what I'm doing day to day in my forecasting? On the other hand, reports like this is called a waterfall chart. It's a very cool way of seeing all of these rolling forecasts in these rows compared to the actuals here in the green, and therefore calculate more comprehensive metrics like average percent error across a range of time. And so in contrast to sort of the tactical view of the exceptions, you know, this might be more the, okay, over the course of a few months, are we in fact improving overall, right? Because we can look at our MAPE and say, well, we've been using the exceptions. Is this number getting better? But when we're done, of course, we want to get the output. And so this, I'm just going to stress how simple it is. You know, I walk through a lot of this functionality very rapidly today, but even there, you can probably see that there's a lot you can do just self-contained in the demand forecasting component. But on the other hand, the final output is actually surprisingly simple, right? At the end of the day, despite all the steps we take to get to these numbers, what we're after is simply an unconstrained demand forecast product by product. And so, you know, this output can look however you want, but here's a very simple example of the forecasts for all of my SKUs. And so this is the output that gets kicked out of Forecast Pro and passed into advanced planning. And so at this point, I will hand it over to Hans to pick up where I leave off.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Eric. I do appreciate that. Let me share my screen now, and we will get my slides going. Okay. So just to confirm that my slide's in view. Excellent. All right. Thanks. Okay. So same thing as Eric. If you were not here last week, I did a brief introduction to our company. I'm going to do an even more brief one this time around. ATS Lean Scheduling International has been focused on advanced planning and scheduling solutions for over 25 years. You can see the time history there as we work through. I will say that the product that we're dealing with, Opcenter APS, used to be called Preactor. It was purchased by Siemens Corporation in 2013, and it has recently been rebranded as Opcenter APS. As far as our company goes, though, we are now a part of ATS Global, which gives us a much larger presence in the marketplace. We're in over 25 countries at this point, and our focus has always been in North America, where the majority, as you can see from the slide, the majority of our customers are in North America, and the majority of customers who use Opcenter APS in North America are our customers. And we have a very, very strong focus on building long-term relationships and growing with our customers. Okay, so today what I'm going to go through is it's going to be a lot, and so I'm going to move very quickly. I'm not going to be able to go very deep into any one area, so feel free to have your questions, but also consider if you see some things that interest you, consider contacting us and let us do something custom for you, focused on your needs, and give you a slower, more deliberate presentation of a solution that would fit for you. What we're going to work on today, though, is I'm going to pick up where Eric left off, showing that the planning module is where we bring the forecast in, we do our work there, and then deliver that plan to the schedule. And then in the schedule is where we're able to do our work there with the schedule and ultimately push everything back up to the ERP system, out to reports, to MES system, and so forth. What you're going to see today is I'm going to start with a very basic trimmed down model for scheduling so that it's not too confusing, to introduce some concepts, show you some views, etc. And then I'm going to shift my focus on 3 specific things. Scheduling tanks, bins, and vessels, and all the unique problems that come with that. We'll go into that in more detail. Scheduling bottleneck operations, and then going bi-directionally. Very common in the process industries. We see it in food. I have an example from a soups and sauces manufacturing facility that we'll be looking at today. And then final one is what we're able to do in helping you schedule ovens, furnaces, autoclaves, etc. And we'll take a look at that, and I'll get into some detail there. All right, so to start with, let's go ahead and pick up the planning module. Okay, so this is the main screen where we land for the planning module. We have a work area here where we're able to pull information in from the ERP system, from the forecast if it's outside of the ERP system, and so forth. So we're able to bring in all of our supply and demand data into the system, and then we have a data set here, basically, where you can see we have all of the items. We have bills of material that tie to those items, and then we also have our planning resources. Planning resources can be production lines, they can be production facilities. It's really just you determine what that resource is and what the capacity is, and then you can plan to it. In this case, we're going to be looking at today, it's going to be production facilities. Then beyond that, as I said, we're importing stock counts and the dates where everything was counted. We brought the forecast in that again that Eric just showed you, and then we're bringing in any kind of additional sales that we have from the ERP system, and then finally we're ready to go ahead and generate a plan. So at this point, I have told it to generate a plan, which is opening on my other screen, and I'll bring that over here now. All right, so we start out working in a tabular format where all of the data is brought in. We're able to see the monthly demand, right? We see demand dates. So whatever our time buckets are, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, however you determine what your planning times are, what your time horizons are in the time buckets. In this case, it's weekly. So for every one of these, for this item, for this date, we have opening stock, demand, and the production that we're going to need to generate to offset any gaps in that between the supply and the demand. And then it'll indicate what our closing stock is for that period. We also are able to see what minimum stock levels are, what target stock levels are, and then this concept of total days of cover, which is a calculated value that takes in all of these factors into account and assures that you're going to have X number of days of cover in order to cover the demand that you have for any given period. And then just a note here, for those of you who have products that have a shelf life, this system will also consider shelf life. So in its planning, it's not going to plan anything with materials that are going to be out of life by the time you need them. It will consider all of that, and you'll be able to isolate those and keep those out of your plan. All right, so the first thing we want to do that I want to start with is to bring in the the stock numbers that we had. So I want to just let the system bring that in, all the stock counts that we had. And now you see some things have changed. We have some indicators that we've got some stuff that is below, right? Below the levels that we need, or approaching, still within limits, but approaching, right? Being out of stock. So if you look now at the grid again, we can see that in this example, my opening stock is 360. I have demand in that period for 115, and that leaves me with 245 as a closing balance for that period. So I'm well within my minimum stock level of 245. I'm sorry, of 90. So now this 245 becomes my opening stock for the next period. Additional demand, a closing stock, which becomes the opening stock, so on and so forth, until we get to a point where I've got 65 in stock, but now I have demand for 195. That leaves me closing stock. I'm at 130 in the hole, and we can see that, and you can just see it only gets worse as we go from there. So this is the tabular view. For those of you who like to work in tabular format, we have all the filters up here. You can do numerous work in this area and get down to the data and study it and look at it. But just by doing a right click, I'm able to see this in another way, which is the stock profile for this item. So in this first item that I have, you can see that we have this yellow line that indicates what the closing stock value is for every given period. So it looks like we're pretty good for about a month here. We're covered for about a month, and then it gets badly negative. So we're going to have to do something to offset that. What we want to see is to see this stock line stay within this blue zone, which is the continually calculated target stock level, which also accounts for the days of cover that we need to be sure that we have for any given time. So right now, we're not doing so well on this item. So what we need to do is we're going to have to do some production. So now I've told it to go ahead and calculate some production to offset that. And happily, we're starting to see more green stuff showing that we're on target now, where we were out of limits before. And when I go to my stock profile and take a look, it's completely different now. You can see that this yellow line indicating our closing stock values is staying pretty close to within this blue zone, which is our target range that we want to be sure that we're staying within. You can interact with this though. You can change these values if for some reason you have some knowledge above and beyond what the system has applied to this, and you have the ability to come in here and you can edit some of these values here, or you can literally interact with this simply by doing some clicking and dragging if you want to change quantities. And you can see that it's dynamically changing the quantity and then adjusting everything to account for the changes that I've made. So you can do that not just with your supply, but you can also do it with any of the demand that you have in here as well and make adjustments to that. So it's very dynamic in the way that you can interact with it. So that's a really high level to show overview of the stock management portion of this, but now we have capacity to manage as well. So we're going to go to another view, which is going to allow us to see what our capacity is. And in this case, I'm showing the capacity of 3 different plants, and juxtaposed against that then is all of our production activity that we need to do. So as we look at this right now, it's pretty clear that we're well within capacity on some of these. I apologize, the capacity of each resource is indicated by the shaded area. So the total capacity of the London facility, for instance, you can see is this line, this purple line here. This can be changed according to your calendar to account for seasonality, to increases in your capacity and so forth. I just did mine straight line, but we have a calendar behind this that you can make these adjustments. So at this point, we're out of balance. So we can interact with it if we want. We can decide that this particular item code, SKU 10019, we can move that forward. Maybe we can move this one forward, and maybe that one we move, I don't know, we move it out here or something like that. So we can work on balancing capacity in that way. We might also decide that we would like to take some of this and pull it into other plants, but it has to be something that we can run in that plant, or it's going to stop us from making a mistake just to make a pretty looking graph that isn't real, right? So it forces us to honor the fact that we simply don't have the capacity to do it in that facility. So what we end up with is we have a set of tools to let the system do this automatically. So we can tell it, constrain it within the capacity that you have, or move it and find it capacity somewhere else, or do some combination of them. So I'm just going to grab one of these. I'm going to run it again and say, just run through and calculate it. And this is going to take longer than it did before. This is going to take 10 or 15 seconds of time, because it's going and looking at all of those facilities. It's trying to constrain everything within that facility. And then if it can't fit it within the capacity at that facility, it's trying it on all the other facilities as well. So it's going through a lot of activity, if you will, right now, as it's trying to move these jobs that are out of capacity into a situation where we're going to have more capacity, and ultimately be able to have some kind of a working plan for where we're going to do our production and how we're going to arrive at that. Okay, so my 10 to 15 second estimate is a little slow. It's chunking along here. I think it probably doesn't like all the stuff I have going on my laptop. And now we have gotten this to a situation where it has done the best it could, given what we gave it to work with. In this particular situation, we're pretty fortunate that we're about 6-8 months ahead before we have to make some decisions about what we're going to do. Are we going to decide that some of these items can now be run in different facilities where there is capacity and we have time to maybe do a little bit of retooling or something to enable that? The decisions are yours, but the key is you've got to plan well in advance to work with these kinds of problems that you're going to be left with. But beyond that, it's a great tool for balancing capacity across multiple different facilities. You can also pull together multiple different views of different facilities, even your subcontractors, and keep track of what you have sitting out in subcontractors. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to stop with planning at this point, and I'm going to go ahead and say that we have done our plan and we've saved it and we've published it now. So now that we've published the plan, it can be picked up by the schedule. So now the scheduler is here, and the scheduler in one of those 3 plants that we just looked at is now able to say, okay, so I'm going to start my day and I'm going to come in and import orders from the ERP, import forecasts if they're at the the plan from the planning module, or any kind of supply demand data that we have in systems that we're attached to. We're going to pull that into this workspace. And in the same way, we have items, we have resources, we have our supply, our demand, our production orders. We have all of that in this schedule. And so now it's time to go ahead and generate a schedule, and let's start doing the work that we have. So the plan has fed us jobs now that we want to work with in this schedule. And what I have here, to be honest, is a slimmed down data set so that it's easier for me to demonstrate a few things. So basically, when we're looking at this, it's a Gantt chart view. Your primary work area here is a Gantt chart. So that means down the left-hand side, you have your resources, you have a time horizon across here, and every one of these colored blocks is an operation which is a part of a larger job, or it's a standalone job in and of itself. We can identify these multiple different ways. We have a whole tool set for grabbing different kind of attributes and colorizing them and being able to highlight things on the board using these attributes and colors. It's a very visual tool. So in addition to the Gantt chart view, we also have an editor view, which is tabular. Lots of filtering, the ability to highlight things, pull things off the schedule, schedule them apart from everything else. You can do a lot with the editor view, even though it's simply just a tabular view. We have a utilization window where we can see the utilization of all of our assets, including secondary constraints, which I'll be getting into in a moment, operators, tooling, etc. And then we have this view, which is called a Material Explorer. And what the Material Explorer allows you to do, I'll just grab this one, is to say, I'd like to see this in the Material Explorer. So this shows me, this is the job that I just clicked on. This is showing me the materials that I have coming into this job. In this case, I have some inventory. The inventory is a pork chop. Pork chop's going in on operation 10, and the output of operation 30 is a prepared pork chop, which is then going into this job, which is going to do more. So I can click on that job and see, oh, well, this is where the chop comes in, but we've also got salad, rice peel-off, mixed vegetables come into this. The output is this finished product, of which 5 are going to a sales order, and the remainder are going to be going into a freezer to be used at a later time. So you can go back and forth here. I could look at this and say, salad, I wonder what else is using the salad. And I can double click on that. And now I've gone backwards and I can see that's made up of these 3 elements. And I see that 1 of them comes from inventory and 2 of them are purchase orders. And the date of when those purchase orders will arrive is on there. And the schedule honors that date and will not schedule it prior to that purchase order being available. So this is a great tool. You can move back and forth through it very, very visually, as I showed you. You can also see orders that have shortages, and you can see unused materials. So if you're out or short of materials, you can make some decisions about substitutions that you may wish to do. Back to the Gantt chart. So at this point, a couple things I wanted to point out here as well. The system is not just wide open capacity, it is capacity constrained. So the first thing is, if you don't work 24/7, 365, you're going to have to put some non-working periods on your board. And I've demonstrated that down here with a simple template, a working day template showing I'm working an 8-hour day, half-hour lunch, done for the night, same thing, goes on and on and on. Jobs will not consume any capacity in non-working periods. It will assume you're not working, so it will just stretch a job over that period of time, assuming you'll pick it up and go on from there once everybody's back to work. So the calendar controls your capacity, but also it allows you to have other things that you work with as well. So I'm just going to look at my tumbler here and just say, if we have a breakdown, right? Say the piece of equipment breaks down. What's the impact of that going to be? I've got this schedule. We worked it all out. Everything's all synchronized and lined up. What is the impact of me having a breakdown? Well, it looks at the time period that I say we're going to be broken down, and it just pushes everything out. And it says, now we've got to do something to figure out how we're going to manage this. So this is where we have a tool called the Repair Schedule tool. And what that does is we'll correct those types of inconsistencies, things that are out of sync, and so forth. So by using that tool, I was able to effectively push all of the jobs beyond that non-working period where the machine is down, and then it just picks up the flow from there for everything. Now, at this point, we're lucky because it hasn't made anything late yet. Everything here is still on time because we have our sales orders down here and our sales order dates, so we're good there. So what it looks like is nothing seems to be a problem, except there actually is a problem. And that is that our secondary constraints at this point, in this case, operators, are being violated. And that's what this red indicates. What does that mean? It means in this example, I have 2 operators, and I need 2 operators in the prep kitchen for any work I'm doing in the prep kitchen. So I can go ahead and pass over this, and we can see, 2 operators, 2 operators, 2 operators. Uh-oh, now I need 3 operators, but I only have 2. So that's a problem. Here I need 4. I'm going to need 4 operators, but I only have 2. So this is one of the what if tools that you have, that it will allow you to do this kind of work and see what are my actual staffing needs, right? You can run this with in an unconstrained way and see what you might actually need. And then maybe you can staff up and make sure that your stuff is on time. But reality says, no, we do actually have secondary constraints. We need to honor that. What are we going to do? So I'm going to repair the schedule again to account for that. And you'll see what it did is it moved the schedule now so that we never violate the need for 2 operators at any given time. And the net result of that was that it ended up making this order late which is now indicated by a red bar and red print on the job tab itself. So that's just a very high level overview. Again, there's a ton of stuff that we could cover that would be probably very useful to you and some of the very specific issues that you have. But in the interest of time, I need to let that one go there and want to now move on and start getting into some of our industry specific issues that we want to talk about. The first one, tanks, vessels, and bins. Well, what's the big deal with that? So we have process equipment that fills a tank, and then we have packaging equipment that draws off of that tank. This sounds pretty basic. Fill the tank with some kind of liquid or powder if it's a bin, or some other kind of substance, and then you draw it off. So what it looks like in practice, just using colorization, we have it's being processed, it's going into the tank, and then it may need to sit in that tank for a period of time. Right? It may have a dwell time. It may be something that's cultured and it has to sit and grow at a certain temperature for a period of time. Whatever that is, right? We have we've mixed some chemicals together and they have to have a reaction time. It sits in that bin until the time is right. So we're scheduling that. We're scheduling that dwell time as a part of all of this. And then the time for the equipment to draw it off. And then ultimately we move on. So what I want to address now in that scenario is, well, what if when we have a batch A and we have a batch B, and what if there are elements in batch A that should never meet the elements in batch B for cross-contamination of allergens or even something explosive if you're working with volatile chemicals? So we want to be sure that we have a mechanism for keeping all of that clean. And so that's where then from one batch to another, where they're not compatible, we have to do some kind of a cleanup, whether it's a partial cleanup, a full cleanup, and not just the vessel itself, but also the lines that feed it and the lines that draw off from it. So cleanup is done. Again, all of this is scheduled because some cleanups are very brief. You got 15 minutes. Other cleanups are 15 hours, right? So all of that is calculated and accounted for. Then we're on to batch B, and I wanted to illustrate yet another thing that we can do in the system here. We have our batch B filling the tank. In this case, it's a 10,000 gallon tank. And I happen to have 3 different orders that are drawing from that total 10,000 are going to pull that 10,000 off. So with that in mind, let me now bring up the next batch, or the next view. And what we have here now is a dairy. So we're looking at a dairy where I have pasteurization equipment, I have blending tanks, I have secondary pasteurization, and then I have tanks, pasteurization tanks. After something has gone through the primary or secondary pasteurization, it's going to go into one of these tanks where it will sit for a period of time. In some cases to be cultured and wait X number of hours so that the cultures can grow. Other cases, just long enough for it to be drawn off and put into some kind of packages. So from a visual point of view, I wanted to show you, and I'm going to walk through this very slowly as to what this looks like when I place an order on the board. What happens is it goes through the pasteurization, and as it's going through the pasteurization, it begins to fill the pasteurization tank, and we are illustrating this and controlling it as well down here with the secondary constraints, where we're now showing there is about 3,500 gallons of milk in this particular tank. And then what this decline here is when at 5 in the morning, when the guys come in to start running the packaging equipment, then they start to draw it off and you can see the quantity goes down. So what happens when we're doing just more than 1 or 2 of these, right? So now I'm just going to start pushing these on, and you can see the quantity of this begins to go up. Even the scale showing the quantity that's in the tank even changes to account for it. So as I go through, we can see now that we're up close to about 9,000 gallons in this tank. And what we have to do at this point is, my goodness, is this order that we have coming in is 4,000 gallons, right? So I've got a 4,000 gallon, but I've only got 1,000 gallons left in the tank. What's the system going to do when it comes time to put this on the planning board? And what it's going to do is find a place for it. Oh, it's going to put it on there as I expected. Let's do that there. And all right, so what I didn't do was bring myself in. Okay, so what it will do, and I did something with my data apparently to clear that out, is it will not fill that up beyond the capacity of the tank itself, but rather it will schedule it out to a point where it begins to draw off after a certain amount of this has already been drawn off by the packaging equipment. So as we're drawing this off, then it continues to fill the tank as it becomes available. And then, lest you think you have to sit here and just do this manually, we can go ahead and do it all and let it populate all of the tanks, control all of the tanks, and then you're able to see it doing things like working in setup, right? You see setup time because we don't want to mix orange juice and chocolate milk. So there's going to be a long period of cleanup that's needed between the two jobs. Okay, so that's a view for what happens when we're scheduling tanks and bins. And then what I wanted to show you is the next problem is when we're scheduling from a bottleneck. In this example, we have a company that's making soups and sauces, basically fresh produce and vegetables, so forth, is prepared, goes into kettles, which goes into fillers, chillers, and down to packing. These assets are connected by lines that are immovable, right? So they are related to each other and can only deliver and pick up from specific assets. So the key here is that we need to schedule these fillers first. So the trick is that we schedule the fillers, set the sequence, and then work upstream to the processing and downstream to the subsequent finishing operations. And then our final pass is to be sure that everything that's going into those kettles is prepared exactly in time. So let's have a look at that and see what that looks like when we bring up this view right here. All right, so in this view, actually, I think I'm going to do it this way real quickly to make it easier to see. So these are just the filler operations now. So we've scheduled the filler operations, and this is the place where we can then come in and begin to work with it and make sure that we're comfortable with what we see, how the system has lined everything up. And the stuff that we're focusing on in this particular model are allergen profiles because we have to avoid cross-contamination. So the system is very dynamic. You know, I could take this and manually drop it, but it's going to calculate setup times as I do it. It's a very dynamic kind of activity. We don't want to do that. So the system then will allow us to interact with it here. This sets the sequence, and then from there, we're able to finally go in and see the entirety of it, seeing all of the operations. My goodness, I'm missing my targets here with my mouse. So now we have the whole thing. And then the final step that we need to do is to backward schedule the preparation kitchen where all the food is to be prepared. And then ultimately what we see when we look at that is we can see then that everything is ready, maintain the sequence of the filling operations, but have everything ready just in time to go into the kettles and flow through the process. Okay, the final thing that I want to show you, and I will be very quick with this, is the oven. And the problem that we have with ovens, if you have you're going to make a chicken, you're going to make potatoes, a cake, and a pie, you're not going to open the oven and put them all in at the same time and hope it all works out. You're going to line things up, you're going to time them. They all have their own requirements. You can do 2 chickens or you can do 20 potatoes in the oven at the same time. So different items have different capacity requirements. So you need to open the oven and close the oven at the same time with the same controls, similar items. And what we're looking for is a rule that is going to do that for us. So the final step then that I wanted to show you today is where we have a schedule that we can just do forwards. And when we get to the ovens, it looks just like what I just showed you in the ovens. It has scheduled everything so that we can see, we can see how everything connects. It's keeping everything in sync, keeping everything, delivered on time. And you could stand here and move these around, but it doesn't make sense to do that because you've got a rule that will do it for you automatically. And that is the oven rule, which takes about 10 to 12 seconds to run because it's doing a lot more work. And what it's doing is finding orders, grouping them, and also making sure that you use the best capacity that you possibly can in the oven the whole time that you're using it. So you want to be sure that you're only fitting in what is capable of being fit in. And now if you look at the ovens in here, you can see that it has lined everything up perfectly while still maintaining all of the connections and all of the sequences that the system put in place. Okay, with that, I know that was all very quick. With that, I'm going to go ahead, and if we have time, and hopefully we do, I'm going to say it's time for some questions. And if anybody put questions in, then Sabina, perhaps you can take that.
Yeah, yeah, and thank you both, Eric and Hans, for those demonstrations. That was really great to see just a little bit even of what the tools can do. I know there's a lot more even than we saw, but thank you. And yeah, we have a couple questions. I know we only have a few minutes left before the formal end of the hour. So we'll maybe just take one or two. So I'll just get right into it. We did get a couple questions. So one of the questions we got asked, how much data is required or recommended in order to get a forecast? So Eric, I think this would be more directed towards you.
Yeah, so pretty straightforward. I mean, quick version is you can generate a forecast with any amount of data first, just as like an underlying assumption. It's just more how much do you need to get a good forecast? That might be stating the obvious. We usually say the magic ideal number is 2 years. You need at least 2 years to find seasonal patterns in your data, right? It's impossible to determine whether, say, like January is higher or lower than normal if you only have one observation for January, for example. So 2 years is kind of a magic number. 3 to 5 is sort of a good sweet spot. But if you have less, it's not something to sweat too much. You can force seasonality or leverage seasonal patterns from similar items for those kinds of things. But anyway, quick version is 2 years is a magic number. 3 to 5 is kind of a good sweet spot.
Awesome, thank you. And we just have 1 minute left, and again in the formal hour, so we'll take one more question, and then hopefully if anyone's able to stay on just a couple more minutes just as we wrap it up, that would be great. But the next question I think is more for you, Hans. Someone said that they do a combination of process and discrete manufacturing. So could one install accommodate all of their processes?
Short answer is yes. So, it's all in the configuration. We model the processes that you do in your plant, and it's not a problem to have a combination of different types of manufacturing in the same model.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you. Well, with that, again, I know we didn't have much time for questions, so we'll leave it at that. Again, we want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we really encourage you to take advantage of the information that just popped up on the screen. You can also scan those QR codes to visit our websites if you want to just quickly visit right now. Both of our companies have websites and social media outlets that are full of a bunch of quality content. We have additional information about the solutions that you saw today, project methodologies, case studies, and videos. And if you do have any further questions or requests, really feel free to reach out to us directly. You see the email addresses here, the phone numbers on the screen. We really would love the opportunity to speak with you. So with that, again, we're at the end of our time. So I think we'll leave it there, but we look forward to connecting with you and meeting you again at one of our future webinars. Thank you.